I was still sitting in my car in the underground parking of my new building. The keys the notary had handed me were literally still warm in my palm. When my phone rang, and my mother told me she'd already arranged for my sister and brother-in-law to move into my second bedroom. What I didn't know yet was that within 3 weeks, an Ontario Landlord and Tenant Board eviction order, 5 months of unpaid rent, a private lending registration in catastrophic arrears, and a maxed-out home equity line of credit on my parents' house would all surface at my aunt's retirement dinner in front of every person in my family who had ever taken my mother's word for anything. I just left the notary's office on King Street West, the transfer documents still in my bag and a completely ridiculous grin on my face that I couldn't get rid of even when I was trying to look normal on the elevator down to the lobby. 10 years of maxing my RRSP, 3 years of treating my TFSA like it was sacred, 32 months of packing lunch and taking the GO train instead of paying for downtown parking, and saying no to every long weekend trip my coworkers planned on the Monday morning before it happened. All of it had finally become a set of keys to a 2-bedroom unit in Etobicoke. It wasn't anything remarkable to look at. 847 square feet. A narrow balcony that faced the parking structure, but I had signed the papers myself. The mortgage was in my name. Not one person in my family had contributed a single dollar to the down payment, and I had worked hard enough and long enough that this no longer felt like something I needed to apologize for. My phone rang while I was still in the lobby. "Your sister and her husband need the second room," my mother said, without any greeting, without any acknowledgement of what day it was or what I'd just done. "Just for a couple of years while they sort themselves out. I've already told them." I stood by the lobby door with one hand still on the handle. A woman came in behind me with a stroller and I stepped aside automatically, the way you do when you're in shock but still functioning on manners. "You told them," I said. "You don't need 2 bedrooms, you're on your own." I'd heard that phrase my entire life. You're on your own, sometimes as a compliment, mostly as a justification for why I was expected to share whatever I had. When I was 18 and my sister was getting her tuition, covered from my parents' savings, I was told I was independent enough to manage student loans on my own. When I was 24 and needed a place to stay for 3 months between apartments, my mother had made a comment about how well I was doing. My sister at 28 had moved back home twice with no timeline and no conditions. That was different apparently. She needed support. I was on my own. I told my mother I'd call her back. I did not call her back. The next morning they showed up. I was still half unpacked, living out of boxes, running on too little sleep and 2 cups of coffee. I'd spent the previous evening putting together a bookshelf from a flat-pack box and watching something on my laptop I can't even name now. I had 1 chair. The kitchen was functional. The second bedroom was empty except for a folding table I was using as a temporary desk. I heard the van before I saw it. A white panel van with a rental company's magnetic logo on the side, backed up toward the visitor entrance of my building. My brother-in-law climbed out of the driver's side, checked his phone, and walked toward the intercom panel like he'd already looked up the unit number. My sister got out of the passenger side carrying my nephew on her hip. He's 3. He was wearing his little blue puffy jacket, the one with the hood that's slightly too big for him, and he was holding his stuffed elephant, the one he slept with since he was born. My sister spotted me on the balcony and waved, just waved, the casual wave of someone arriving for a visit they'd been invited to. My brother-in-law pressed the intercom button. I didn't answer. He pressed it again. My sister tilted her head up at me and her expression shifted. The shift I'd been watching my whole life, the one that goes from pleasant to pointed in about 3 seconds when she realizes something isn't going to be handed to her automatically. I went downstairs. "We've got the van until 6, my brother-in-law said, when I pushed the lobby door open. He said it the same way someone mentions they have a dinner reservation, practical, settled, like the logistics were already done and this was just the physical part. "Your mom mentioned you have a storage unit on P2. "I'm not letting you in," I said. My sister shifted my nephew to her other hip. "He's been up since 5, she said. "Can we just go upstairs and talk about this?" "No." She looked at me the way she'd looked at me my entire childhood. Like my having a position on something was inherently unreasonable. Like standing still was an act of aggression. Our lease ended, she said. We had to be out this morning, we have nowhere to go, you have an empty room. Your lease ended, I said, or your lease was terminated. She didn't answer that. She looked at my brother-in-law. He looked at the sidewalk. I told them to move the van out of the visitor zone before it got a ticket. Then I went back inside, blocked the intercom from my unit settings, and texted my building manager to give him a heads up about what was happening at the front entrance. 20 minutes later, my parents' car pulled into the visitor lot. My father rang the intercom 11 times before switching to my cell. My mother somehow found the building's external management line and called to say she was concerned her daughter might be in some kind of mental health crisis, and could someone please check on me. The building manager, a very calm, very patient man who I am now convinced deserves some kind of award, called me first, asked if I was okay, listened to what was actually happening, and then called my mother back to inform her that if the group didn't leave the property, he would contact bylaw enforcement. They left. My phone went into meltdown about 40 minutes after that. My mother had added me to a family group chat I hadn't known existed, 26 people, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, 2 aunts, an uncle who lived in Alberta, my grandmother on my father's side. The messages were already stacking when I opened the app. My mother's aunt had written a paragraph about how family is the only thing that matters in the end. A cousin I'd grown up with close to had posted a frowning emoji and nothing else. Someone had shared a graphic with a quote about sacrifice. At the top, pinned, was my mother's message. Our daughter has locked her sister and a toddler out of her home. Please keep us in your prayers. I read it once. I put my phone face down. Then I picked it back up, because apparently I needed to make it worse, and I went to my sister's Instagram. She'd posted a video. She was sitting on the bed in what looked like a budget motel room, the kind off the 401, heavy curtains, laminate furniture, a lamp that makes everything look orange. She wasn't wearing makeup. My nephew was in the background pushing a toy truck across the carpet. She spoke quietly, almost in a whisper, like she was trying not to wake him. She told her followers that a family member, no name, but the omission did the work, had turned them away at the door when they had nowhere else to go. Her voice broke once, cleanly, just enough. She said she didn't know what they were going to do. The video had over 300 views by the time I finished watching it. People were leaving comments with motel recommendation chains. Someone had tagged my name in a reply. I set my phone down and stood at the window and looked at the parking structure for a long time. Here's the thing about my sister that I've always known but spent years trying to argue myself out of. She is not careless. She is actually very deliberate. She understands how rooms work, how family dynamics work, how to position herself as the person who needs protecting so that everyone else feels responsible for her outcome. Growing up, that made her the favorite. As an adult, it had apparently evolved into something more structured than I realized. I didn't know yet how literal that was. I found the landlord and tenant board order on a Thursday evening, about a week after everything at the building. LTB decisions in Ontario are public record. You can search the database by address. I had my sister's old apartment address from a birthday card she'd sent me 2 years ago. She'd included her return address out of habit. I ran the search. The order came up on the first result. It was not a lease expiry. The landlord had filed an application for non-payment under the Residential Tenancies Act. The LTB had issued an eviction order after a hearing, with both my sister's and my brother-in-law's names on the document. The rent arrears listed covered 5 months. In Toronto's East End, a 2-bedroom unit runs well above $2,000 a month. 5 months of that is not a small number. I sat with that for a while. Then I kept pulling the thread because it kept giving. My brother-in-law had posted on LinkedIn about transitioning into entrepreneurship about 9 months earlier. My sister's Instagram going back about a year told a different story than the motel video suggested. Tulum in January, a bachelorette weekend in Nashville she'd organized for a friend in March, a spa resort in Muskoka in May. Her captions used language I recognized from a particular kind of social media post. Words like abundance, aligned income, investing in yourself, building something real. I found the company name in a tagged post from about 10 months ago. I won't name it here, but a search brought up a Better Business Bureau complaint file, with 38 entries and an active warning from Consumer Protection Ontario. Most complaints were from distributors who'd purchased starter inventory and either couldn't sell it or couldn't get refunds. Several mentions of required monthly purchase minimums to maintain active status. My sister had posted 21 times about this company. In one video, filmed in their living room, she was surrounded by boxes of product, several $1,000s of inventory stacked against the wall, talking about how this was going to change everything. My nephew's bookshelf was visible in the background. He was 2 in that video. I closed the laptop, made tea, opened it again. It took me another hour to find the loan registration, not the document itself, but a filing on Ontario's Personal Property Registry, a secured interest registered against my sister and brother-in-law, attached to a private lending company. The registration date was about 10 months prior. Private lenders in Ontario operate outside the usual bank oversight. The rates on similar registrations I'd looked at ranged from 18 to 22%. I thought about my parents' house in Brampton. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a double-wide driveway. They'd owned it for 22 years. A house like that in Brampton right now carried significant equity. They'd talked about it at Christmas a few years back, casually, like it was a retirement plan. I thought about the refinancing my mother had denied, when I'd asked about it once, and then mentioned again to a cousin years later as if it were common knowledge. I went to the land title registry. The home equity line of credit showed up in the filings. It had been accessed about 9 months ago. The amount drawn was close to the registered limit. The timing placed it within weeks of the private loan registration. I stopped making tea and started a folder on my desktop. My aunt, my father's older sister, was turning 65 in 3 weeks. She'd spent 30 years as a family law paralegal, raised 2 kids on her own after separating from her husband in the 90s, and was the only person in our extended family who consistently said what she meant and followed through on it. She'd always paid attention to me in a way my parents hadn't. Not indulgently, but with the kind of attention that actually registers what it's looking at. I drove out to Hamilton on a Sunday afternoon. She was in the backyard when I arrived, checking on her tomato plants even though the season was essentially over. She brought them in every September and then checked on them anyway, which is a very specific kind of stubborn optimism I've always found reassuring. We had coffee at her kitchen table. I told her what had happened, the keys, my mother's call that same evening, the van, the group chat, the motel video. I told her I thought there was more happening beneath the surface than what my family was saying, but I didn't tell her what I'd found. Then I asked if my father had been in touch with her lately. She looked at me over her mug, set it down. He called me about a month ago, she said slowly, said he was looking into some investment opportunities, and wanted to know if I'd consider putting in some capital alongside him. Did he say what kind? He was vague, said it was real estate adjacent. I asked him to send me the prospectus and he said it wasn't that kind of arrangement. She paused. I told him I wasn't interested. He seemed annoyed. I nodded. I didn't say anything more about it. I could see her thinking even without me laying it out. 30 years of family law means you recognize the shape of a thing before you're told what it is. My retirement dinner is in 3 weeks, she said after a moment. I know. The whole family will be there. I know that too. She looked at me carefully. Are you planning to come? Yes, I said, I am. I drove home feeling steadier than I had in 2 weeks. The dinner was at a restaurant in Hamilton she'd chosen herself, a private room in the back, round tables, warm lighting, the kind of place that does a set menu for events and actually does it well. About 30 people. I arrived at 6:10. My parents were already seated at the main table. My mother saw me walk in and her expression went through several things quickly. Surprise, then something that settled into satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who'd assumed I was going to make a scene by not showing up and was now revising that assumption into certainty that I'd come to capitulate. My sister and brother-in-law were seated closer to the center. My nephew was with a sitter. My sister was wearing a wrap dress and had her hair done, which told me she'd been expecting this to go a certain way. She looked composed and careful, which was always a signal with her. I sat down, said hello to the cousins near me, accepted a glass of water, and put my bag on the back of my chair. The bag was heavier than usual. The dinner moved through its courses. My father held court the way he always did at family gatherings. He has a particular talent for filling a room with the impression of substance without saying very much that's actually specific. He told a long story about a project at work. He made an early toast to my aunt that was warm and genuine and earned real applause. My aunt watched him from the head of the table with an expression I couldn't quite place. Dessert was served, plates of something chocolate and a fruit tart. My father stood up again. He thanked everyone for making the trip. He spoke for a while about what family meant and about legacy and about the people who shaped you. The part about my aunt was affectionate and some of it was real. They'd grown up in the same house and that counted for something. But then the tone shifted, the way I'd spent 3 weeks knowing it would, and he turned and looked at me. He said that this evening was also a chance to share some good news. He said that after a difficult few weeks, their family had found a solution. He said that I had come to see the importance of what they'd been asking, and had agreed to open my home to my sister while she and her husband found their footing. He looked at me with an expression of practiced warmth, the specific warmth of a man who has already decided how this ends, and said he was proud of me for doing the right thing. He raised his glass. 4 people started clapping. I let the applause run its course, fully. I waited until it had stopped completely and the air had settled back into itself. Then I pushed my chair back, stood up and said, "I haven't agreed to anything." The clapping stopped very abruptly. I reached into my bag and took out the folder I'd printed the night before, tabbed, color-printed, enough copies for the family members at the surrounding tables. I set the stack on the table. I slid individual copies toward my aunt, toward my father's brother, toward my mother's sister, toward the cousin who'd been in the group chat the most. "I want to explain what's actually going on," I said, "because some of you have spent the last 3 weeks calling me selfish based on information that wasn't accurate, and I think you deserve to know the truth." My father said, "Sit down." I did not sit down. I explained what an Ontario LTB eviction order was, for anyone who wasn't familiar. I said that my sister and brother-in-law hadn't lost their apartment because a lease ran out. I said there was an order from the Landlord and Tenant board for non-payment of rent, 5 months of it, and that the order was a public document and I had printed it on page 2 of what I'd just handed them. I said that during those 5 months there had been a trip to Tulum, and a trip to Nashville, and a significant financial investment in a company that had nearly 40 consumer complaints on file with the Better Business Bureau. My aunt already had her reading glasses on. She was on page 3. My sister said my name very sharply. I looked at her and then I kept going. I said I had found a secured interest registration on the personal property registry tied to a private lending company, with my sister's and brother-in-law's names on it, dated about 10 months prior. I said I didn't have the loan document itself, but that the registration was public record, and that the timing aligned with a draw on my parents' home equity line of credit that was also in the land title filings. I said I believed the reason my parents had wanted me to house my sister for a couple of years wasn't about family or compassion. It was because if my sister's housing costs were covered, her income could be redirected towards servicing a debt my parents had co-signed or funded. My mother pressed her hand to her mouth. My father said, "That is not what this is." My aunt looked up from the folder. She took off her reading glasses and held them loosely in one hand. She looked at my father the way I imagined she'd looked at a lot of people over 30 years of family law. "You called me last month," she said, "and asked me to invest in a real estate opportunity." He opened his mouth. "Yes or no," she said. The room was completely still. That was a separate yes or no. He said yes. She set the folder flat on the table. "I want to make sure I understand what's happened," she said. Her voice was even, unhurried. "You co-signed Elaine's loan for a business that failed. You drew on your home equity to do it. You are now trying to use your daughter's home, a home she purchased by herself, without any help from anyone in this family, as a financial arrangement to cover that debt. And when she said no, you told 30 people she'd turned a toddler away at the door." My father began to say something. She held up one hand, just one hand barely raised, and he stopped. "I've been watching this family for 65 years, she said. I've watched this girl work for everything she has while everyone around her assumed she'd absorb whatever was needed. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I didn't hear what I just heard. She turned and looked at me. Something in her face settled into something clear. You bought your home, she said. You keep it. Nobody at this table has any claim on it. I drove back to Etobicoke with the radio off. The highway was unusually clear, that late October emptiness when summer's really gone, and the winter rush hasn't started yet. I had the heat on low and both hands on the wheel, and I thought about very little for most of the drive. My parents left the dinner before dessert was cleared. My sister and brother-in-law followed a few minutes later. Nobody said anything to me on the way out. The cousin who'd been most active in the group chat found me by the coat rack and hugged me without explanation, and I hugged her back, and she said sorry quietly, and I said it's okay and I meant it. My aunt walked me to my car. I'm sorry it got this far, she said. It would have gone further, I said, if I'd said yes. She nodded once, squeezed my hand, and went back inside. I blocked my parents' numbers about a week after the dinner. Not that night. That night I just needed it to be quiet. But a week later, after my mother had cycled through 3 days of messages that went from threats to guilt to something approximating an apology and back to threats again, I blocked both numbers. My brother-in-law sent one message saying I'd regret this and that they were starting fresh. I blocked him too. My sister didn't reach out at all, which, in a strange way, was the most honest thing she'd done in a long time. My aunt called me once a week for the first month after, just briefly, just to check in. Not to relitigate anything. She never brought up the dinner again. She asked how the condo was coming together, whether I'd found a decent grocery store nearby. I had. There's a no-frills 2 blocks away, and a farmer's market on Saturday mornings in the school parking lot down the street that I've started going to most weeks, even just for the walk. The family group chat still technically exists, as far as I know. I left it quietly in November, when I noticed a thread asking if anyone knew of furnished short-term rentals in the GTA. I read enough to understand that my sister and her husband had found a basement apartment somewhere in Scarborough. I wished them well in the way you can wish someone well without wanting to be involved. Sincerely, and from a distance, and then I left the chat and went back to the bookshelf I was building. The second bedroom is a proper home office now. I have a real desk and a monitor and a plant my friend brought over when she came for dinner in December. She'd been the one I called on the worst day of all of it, when the group chat messages were coming in faster than I could mute them, and I was sitting on my bathroom floor eating crackers and genuinely asking myself if I was the one being unreasonable. She'd said no. Flatly, without any drama, the way good friends do. She'd been right. She sat across from me at my table in December, and we drank wine and she told me about her week and I told her about the farmer's market and we talked about nothing important for 3 hours. It was one of the best evenings I'd had in a long time. Possibly one of the best evenings I'd had in years, if I'm being honest with myself about how much of the previous years I'd spent managing other people's feelings about my choices. Some evenings, even in winter, I sit on the balcony with a blanket and a hot drink, and I look out at the parking structure and I think about the decade of lunches I packed, the trips I said no to, the paychecks I didn't spend. I used to frame all of that as sacrifice. I don't anymore. It was just paying for something that mattered to me. The keys are still on the hook by the door. I see them every time I come home. I don't think I'll ever stop noticing them, and I don't think I'll ever want to.